Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? All good? Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stefan. And thank you for coming. I'm really excited to tell you about something that's happening in my context and some spotlights that are very interesting, and I hope you'll find them interesting as well. So I think a good place to start is to maybe get a bit of a show of hands. How many of you are Gen Zs here? You? Okay. Very few, wow. Maybe about a third, which is very interesting because if you do the same straw poll in many African countries, in Johannesburg, in Nairobi, in Kinshasa, in Kigali, we consistently find that the majority of the room is actually millennial and Gen Z. Gen Z in particular having a very interesting effect in terms of the economics of these big African cities, and it's creating something that we call the youth dividend. And that's the big thing that I want to talk to you about today, because if 60% of a continent is under the age of 25, then the structures around these young people must shift, right? They must respond to the age and the restlessness that young people have. And that's a really big part of why I almost named this talk The Young and the Restless, but a little bit too funny, I think. So let's have the same kind of grounding point and start with an understanding of what a youth demographic is, right? So there's a golden ratio, 1.71, which is the population ratio that we're expecting in the African continent, where rapid economic growth is possible because of a larger contribution of labor to growth, right? Essentially, there's much more population density within the population that are working, that are in the workforce in both the informal and formal sectors versus the population that are not working, so very young people, very old people. That's very, very different than, of course, what's happening in a lot of European countries and the West more broadly. And so it places an interesting shift in terms of how Africa's role will look in the next 25 years as we head towards this ratio, right? And the other thing I want you to maybe think about as we talk about this youth demographic in more detail within the case studies is that this is something that we've seen historically before. So China hit a similar ratio. Theirs was much larger, 2.8 to 1, in the year 2010, and it drastically shifted the economic and political context in China. Similarly, in Asia, a demographic dividend was reached in 2013, also about 2.6. And so these large demographic shifts have been seen before, and we don't really know where the African continent is going to go with its demographic shift, but I think we can ask some interesting questions about what could happen. So let's start in one of my favorite cities, the city my mom was born in, Nairobi. A fantastic place. If you've never been, you should probably leave now and head directly to Brandenburg and get to Nairobi. It's an incredible place, teeming with life, very, very bustling. What you see on the left there is a typical Monday at 11 p.m. It's just always bustling. But what's also really interesting about Nairobi is that it has a 67% youth unemployment rate. So when I say the young and the restless, Nairobi is an interesting example of that, right? The other thing about Nairobi is that there's a large mobile connectivity. 96.3% of Gen Zs in Kenya use TikTok daily. And many of them, 67% of them, use TikTok for the news. So there's a political sphere that's showing up in Nairobi. There's a very interesting digital nativity that's growing in terms of its impact in the political sphere. And there's nothing that typifies this more than this incredible headline. This was in June, when Nairobi exploded with what was called a youth revolt, right? Young people were on the streets initially about a singular bill that was passed. It was called the finance bill, which, finance gazettes, as you'd call it here in Germany. And the young people in Kenya were organizing primarily on X, on TikTok, on all the meta platforms. And it exploded into a very interesting political moment because Kenya is so deeply digitally native that the majority of the organizing, the majority of the interactions were happening online. Now, if you're African and you've seen the story before, you're probably wondering, did they switch off the internet? which is usually what happens when something like this explodes. But they didn't. They couldn't, for whatever reason. And this generation had a lot of impact. In fact, the bill that they were protesting was repealed almost immediately after several rounds of protests. The government was forced to listen, right? One thing that was also really interesting and that I find quite fun is that this protest movement was at the same time that ChatGPT launched its customized GPT models. And so in Kenya, the young people created a finance bill GPT. It was available in 8 local languages, and it translated these very dense legislative documents about economic development forecasting into very everyday language in African languages that are not often interacting with this tech world, right? So the Silicon Savannah was really pushing forward a new way to think about public participation and what AI can do in that context. I think what's also fun is this was a moment of digital accountability. So Kenya's a very complicated political space. It hasn't always been the most transparent democracy. Until 2002, Kenya wasn't even a multi-party democracy. And so when this generation comes to the fore and they start asking important questions about the political context that they're in, they're asking it in a time where their voices might just be heard. These are some shots from the almost 2 months of protests that were involved in this moment. Unfortunately, straight repression is not a thing of the past in Kenya, and 39 young people were killed. Many more were tortured and arrested by the government. But I think what we can take away from this moment is that there's a bit of a generational legitimacy crisis in Kenya, right? There's young people who feel that they must revolt, they must go to the street, they must use their platforms in every way they can to speak back to the government that is considerably older than them. And it's a really interesting battleground to be working in. Okay, and then let's go to Rwanda. Another one of my favorites. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, a little bit of an Afro-optimist. But what's really interesting for me about Kigali and Rwanda more broadly is a declaration from the Rwandan government that the path that they're going to follow in terms of a development pathway is the Singapore path. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Singapore path, but it has some very interesting specifics to it, right? To become the Singapore of Africa, they've had to implement really strong central governance, a very, very quick, rapid development process, and they've tried to focus on becoming a regional hub. So Kigali, the city that's called the land of 1,000 hills, is emphasizing order, efficiency, state-led planning, and a very tight control on what can happen in the public sphere. There's been some interesting successes. The Ministry of Technology and Innovation has brought in $200 million in funding. They've implemented what's called the Kigali Innovation City, and if you go to Kigali, it's about here. It's a fantastic space where there's digital hubs, there's maker spaces, there's a lot of startups involved. But what's very difficult maybe for Kigali to start to grapple with on the other side of this interesting tech miracle is that economic progress is coming at the cost of citizens' rights. These are 5 of 8 dissidents that have been recently arrested in the last 2 years in Kigali for internet activities contrary to the state. I'm going to leave to your imagination what that might mean. But what's really scary, I think, about this is that Kigali seems to believe that the opportunity to become a tech hub will not come at the cost of political and social dissent. And its citizens, very young people, the average age of these 8 dissidents is 22 years old, seem to not agree. Last but not least is a story that kind of made me very worried about the specific victims that are falling by the wayside in this technology story. This is Lilian Mugabekazi. She attended a concert in Kigali. She's 22 years old as well. She wore this dress, and I've cropped it a little bit, but it went viral in Rwanda. And after a month of discussions online, Lillian was arrested. And she's currently on trial for public indecency, and she is facing 2 years in prison. And when there's a very terrifying interview with the Kigali police commissioner who's asked, why are you taking this case? What is so important about this moment? And he says that Kigali is thinking about its growth, but it's also thinking about its long-term old school values. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was very young and I heard the term old school values, very seldom landed well. So we'll see. Maybe Lillian won't be a victim of this, but also maybe this is a trend that we're going to continue seeing in Kigali. More young people having to interact with what it means to be online, but also with the very strict central government values that Kigali is trying to keep. All right. And then last, but certainly not least, is Kinshasa. Kinshasa is a complicated place. The Democratic Republic of Congo in general is a complicated place. My parents were equally enthused about political spheres in Africa, and I grew up constantly hearing about the DRC. The DRC has been at war for the last 30 years. And 1 million victims have been the collateral damage of this continual fight for mineral rights. And a fight that we're going to see increase, right? So there was a very moving speech by a Rwandan doctor on the right there, Denis Mukwege. Denis Mukwege won the Nobel Prize in 2018. And he's an incredible doctor. He's an obstetrician, and he works in the Eastern DRC. And his work is primarily to support women who've been victims of extreme sexual violence in these areas of the DRC where critical minerals are the primary, shall we say, battleground. His work is incredible, but in his acceptance speech for his Nobel Prize, he did this. He did this on the stage. He lifted his phone and he asked, does anyone else have one of these? And obviously, everyone, we all do. But what was really moving is that afterwards he spoke about how these devices that we use are a key part of the downstream of the work that he does, right? So he was linking the extreme sexual violence that he works in with the very complicated value chains that tech hardware in particular is having an impact in the DRC. And I think this visual on the left reminds us about the critical minerals that are a part of the tech that we use. And it's very easy to forget the human cost of these inputs. In particular, we're talking about the 2024 December case that the DRC launched against Apple. They're suing Apple. It's the first time in history that a country is suing a multinational. And the court case alleges that Apple is very aware of the conflict minerals and the blood minerals that are a part of their value chain and are doing very little to stop that. In Apple's defense, in their media briefing, their view is that the downstream of their value chain is not their fault, that they can't be expected to track the inputs that are a part of their product. They talk about the complications of international value chains. And maybe it's a compelling case. Brussels and Paris are going to hear the case in the next 12 months. But I think maybe what rings true for me is the understanding that if we're trying to meet our net zero goals in 2050, the DRC will have to, estimated, provide 6-fold more minerals. So the current conflict is 30 years in the making at a really difficult point, and we still need 6 times more of these minerals to come out of that region. And maybe like me, who's not a energy expert, you didn't know this, but critical minerals are actually abundant across the world. There's no need for the DRC to be at the level that it is for us to still have tech. These are goals that are not mutually exclusive. And in particular, I think it really rings true for me in a paper called Geography and Global Warming. It was written by Andrew Sayer, and his subtitle was incredible: Can Capitalism Be Greened? And in this 2009 paper already, right, this is almost 15 years ago, Sawyer concludes something very interesting, that the world can afford to transition towards net zero, but what it can't afford is the demands of the rich. And I think that really puts into perspective the fact that there's no need for the situation in the DRC to continue as it is. It's a desire. It's a economic and strategic decision that is made for these companies to continue to take critical minerals from the DRC, knowing what they know about the value chain. And so I think it's really important for us to start asking those difficult questions of these corporations and holding them to account to the commitments that they make about how we meet net zero. These are some headlines of this case, and I hope you will, like me, keep abreast of what happens, and maybe we can start shifting the dial on what's happening in the DRC and holding Apple to its supplier code of conduct. And if I can close maybe with this thought that, we can zoom out, right? We can zoom out, I think, is really important to me. And if you're thinking about how you can be more informed about what's happening in the DRC, I highly recommend a book that recently came out by Ernst Schneider called The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And it really gives you some perspective, not just on what's happening in the DRC, but also what's the underbelly of the critical minerals conversation in Ukraine, in Greenland, as we head to net zero, hopefully with better principles in our last industrial revolution. All right. Thank you. And let's have a conversation.